Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video I'm going to teach you guys how to answer the most popular question in PoE: what build should I play? So this question is actually way more complicated than most people give it credit for, and in this video, by the end, you're going to be able to have an answer for it pretty much every single time. So to understand this question, you really need to understand what point of the game you're in. You know, are you in the league start? You know, are you moving into the end game? Do you want to do a mapper? Do you want to have a bosser maybe? You know, all these things are going to contribute to what kind of a character you should be making, looking into, and kind of building overall. So in this video, you guys are going to understand the category of builds, what they do, and what you want to look for when you're going for that kind of build. So let's get straight into it and we'll start the video off. So, league starters comes up as number one. So what are some good league starters? You know, an Arc Miner, Bladeful Blade Blast, you know, all of these sorts of things, you know, totems, like Freezing Pulse totems. All of these are fantastic league starters, and what makes a good league starter? So, overall, if you're a new player, you're coming into the game, or, you know, you're starting off a league, like, you know, we all start on, you know, Twilight Strand, you don't have a lot of currency, all of these things, you know, you're going to want to roll a league starter. Those are the builds that you should look for, you know, ignore everything else. So what makes a good league starter though? So a good league starter needs to be capable of doing all of the bosses in the game. You know, it doesn't need to be good at them, it just needs to be capable of doing them all, you know. So if you can do Shaper on 3 and 4 portals, good stuff. You know, if you can take down Uber Elder, you know, on like 5 portals, you know, fine. If you can do all the invitations white, you're in good shape. You know, these are the things that your league starter should be able to do. That's what you should be aiming for. Now, the requirements for a league starter to be good also are that it doesn't take a lot of investment. It needs to be low budget. You know, if you're looking up league starters and some guy's got a 6-link Starforge or a 6-link Foul's Fur, that's not a league starter. That is absolutely out of the question. Your league starter should be like rocking like a Tabula, and, you know, maybe at most, you know, some 20C uniques. You know, pushing it would be like some very specific 1x kind of jewels or something like that. But, you know, it needs to be low budget, and it needs to be obtainable with stuff that you can get, you know, throughout your Atlas mapping journey. You know, you'll probably generate 2 or 3, maybe even 4x on the way to these endgame bosses, you know, but you're not looking for a 20 or 30x build here, you know. You're looking for something that's budget and something that'll get the job done so that you can make a better character later on. So what my friend always refers to league starters as is a pickup truck. Imagine that your first car, you know, you're not looking for a Lamborghini. You're looking for that utility vehicle, the one that'll get all the content done, you know, get all the awakening levels open, you know, take down all the bosses, and then you invest in the Lamborghini, which is a highly specialized vehicle. You know, you go fast, you know, all that sort of stuff like that. It's flashy. So yeah, that's what it needs to be. It needs to be cheap. It needs to be capable of doing all content, but at the same time, it needs to be a reasonable mapper. And, you know, because we have to do tons and tons of maps to get through the Atlas, you know, complete all the awakening levels and get to the endgame content in the first place. So those 3 builds I mentioned at the start, you know, they have okay clear. You know, we don't need to be rocking an explosion chest or anything like that, but they need to have okay AoE. You know, if you're kind of going along with your, you know, with your Ice Spear totems, you know, you might have a little bit of trouble with the clear department, even though you're an insane bosser. You know, you might want to look into a bit of a more AoE focused build. That is going to be good. So maybe you don't use Ice Spear, but you use Freezing Pulse totems. You know, that's a lot better. So it's a lot more hybrid kind of play style there. You know, so you want some good clear, but you also want to have some good mobility. You know, you don't want to be playing, you know, an RF Scorching Ray Jug with like no AoE and, you know, really slow like cast speed and all stuff like that. You might be an absolute beast at bossing, but that's not a good league starter because it's going to take you so long to do maps, and you know, it won't be that optimal. So yeah, it needs to have a bit of speed, bit of AoE, but it also needs to be durable and have enough damage to do bosses. So, you know, that's where it really starts to get tricky, and finding a balance of all those things on a budget is where you really need to find, you know, a really highly tuned build. You know, so the ones I mentioned earlier are really good due to the fact that they scale just purely off gem levels alone. And that's going to be a really good tip for you guys. A lot of league starters aren't going to be attack based. You know, so if you're asking me, can I league start, you know, bows? Well, you know, my answer to you would be league start elemental hit, because that scales off gem levels, and that is free scaling that you can get access to without having to buy uniques and stuff like this, which is definitely a big plus. So, you know, a spellcaster, anything that scales off gem levels, those are always going to be good picks. minions, all sorts of stuff like that. So prioritize a bit of speed and also a bit of clear, and your league starter is going to be looking really good. So let's say that you've done the league starter, you've gotten through all the content, you've unlocked it all, and your time to specialize. You want to get into a really overpowered build, and really get into the meat potato of PoE's endgame. So you can kind of go down to two different paths, or you can go down both of them ultimately. So a mistake that a lot of newer players make is they try and build the ultimate character. A character that can build can one-shot bosses, do 100% delirium, move in an insane speeds, and all sorts of stuff like that. Well, that character may exist if you've got 2 or 3 mirrors and you're playing an aura stacker. But even an aura stacker isn't going to be as good as some of the highly specialized tailored builds. So my advice to you would be that you want to build a specialized build, and that is going to make your characters far more powerful. If I had to give you an example, let's say you're trying to do Shaper, or the Feared Invitation. That requires an incredible amount of damage, an incredible amount of defense, and sustain. You can't go in there on a deck stacking tornado shotter, right? You're just going to get one shot. So you need to build defensive layers, you need to build burst damage and just damage overall, you need to build life sustain and stuff like that. But then if you were to go into a map, all of that time, money, and gear that you invested in those defenses wouldn't be that valuable, because maps don't really do a lot of damage to you. You don't need all that sustain, you don't need all of that defense and damage. It would just be overkill. But at the same time, if you go on a mapper, they prioritize stuff like speed, moving fast, big AoE damage. And if you would have then taken that into Shaper, you don't need all that AoE damage. You don't need all that movement speed. But that's really good at mapping, but it's not good in bossing. So my advice after you get your league started done and you've gotten through that story is build a highly specialized build for the thing that you want to do most. The most powerful characters will always be good at one job primarily, and they're not that good at another job. So trying to build a character that's good at everything is kind of where a lot of players go wrong, and that's definitely not the way to take it. If you want to have a character that can do bosses, have that character. But then if you also want to do maps at the same time, have 2 characters and swap between them based on what you need to do. That's going to be the best strategy, and that's how most players play Path of Exile in the end game, and it's far more efficient and lets you make way more powerful characters because you can invest all in one direction and you're going to be able to make an absolute beast. So let's get into the different categories that you can assume that your characters can kind of go down, and we'll kind of give some examples as well. So league starters, that's how we started. Let's get into mappers. So mappers primarily are all about speed and AoE. They don't really worry about defense and sustain because they can get a lot of that from their flasks, which will always be up even without being a Pathfinder. So, if you get in there and you're investing all in speed, that's so you can run more maps per hour and make more money. AoE, critical for a mapper because, you want to clear a full screen at once so that you can kind of get through that quicker and you're not, for example, cycloning around or anything like that to kind of clean up mobs. You want to one-shot them all, move on to the next pack. That's kind of what makes a mapper very powerful. In addition to that, you probably want some sort of proactive defense kind of mechanic. So dying in maps, it's not a big deal, but it will make you slower, you'll lose XP, no one wants that. So most mappers use proactive defenses, specifically in stuff like Delirium and stuff like that, which we'll get to later. Proactive defenses are the most powerful. And what is a proactive defense? Well, it's something like freeze, something that makes it so that you can basically make it so they can't react. So if you're in a map and you're doing incredible damage, you're either one-shotting all the mobs or you're freezing all the monsters, they have no chance to hit you. This isn't a mechanic that works on bosses at all because, you can't really freeze bosses, and even if you could, they'll get stuck in their phases and stuff like that. So when you're making a mapper, you want to prioritize, either one-shotting them or a proactive defense like freeze, and you want to prioritize speed and AoE. So some good examples of this are, like Blade Vortex with an explosion chest, an int-stacking Wanda, maybe a deck stacking Tornado Shotter using Hydrosphere. These are all incredible clear speed builds, and they're going to be the best mappers when you're looking to really get through a lot of maps quick, and they're going to be an absolute dream train to play on when you're trying to do that content. Very, very powerful. But if you took them into bossing, for example, your league starter is probably going to have a better time than that character in the bossing department. Okay, let's move on to the second category here, which you may want to specialize in, and pretty much what you're seeing in the background here is a perfect example of bossing. So bosses traditionally are, their goal in the game is to move through bosses and smash them as fast as possible. So they need incredible burst damage, but they also need incredible durability, because dying in bosses, can be fairly tedious and time consuming, and you also run the risk of, breaking a fight if you die too much. So most bosses will have incredible defense and sustain. They'll also have incredible burst damage, and they generally, a lot of them do have very, very quick movement speed. So, they can clear the bosses as quickly as possible, and really get around arenas, and stuff like that. Like, let's say you're trying to farm Guardians. Movement speed is a big priority, because you can get to that boss faster. You can one-shot it, next map. One-shot it, next map. That's kind of what a good bosser does, and it's going to definitely excel at those things. Specifically with Shaper, you could be talking a 3-minute Shaper versus an 8-minute Shaper, just because you have a ton of movement speed and burst damage. So that's kind of what bosses go for, and that's what you're seeing in the background here on the Mind Over Matter Miner. It's got incredible defense and burst. Some examples of some really good bosses are, the Mind Over Matter Miner, Elemental Hit Totems, Elemental Hit Slayer. What else we got? We got, all sorts of stuff like that. I got a list here, actually, I should be reading off here. What else we got? We got down. Here we go. We got Spectres, Mana Blight, all sorts of things like that. So bossing is all about, burst damage, speed, and massive defenses. And if you really push into the end game, you really need a lot of these things, like when you're doing the Maven invitation carries and rotors and all sorts of stuff like that. But if you took this character and you put it into a mapping situation, yeah, it might have a lot of movement speed, but generally most like big single target abilities, like Barrage, Elemental Hit, Ball Lightning, stuff like this isn't the best at mapping compared to something like, an Explosion Chest Blade Vortex character. They don't really compare. But if you had both characters, you have best of both worlds. That's what I'm really kind of preaching here. And after you get done with your League starter, you should really specialize a character in each of these fields to have the best possible experience and really have the most powerful experience in the game. So next up, I kind of want to get into some more niche things. So we understand League starters and why a good League starter exists and, what it's for and all sorts of stuff like that. We understand mappers and bosses and how they kind of are two sides of the same coin, and you probably want to have both of them. But what about some other characters that are even more specialized? Why would you want to go for them? So let's get on to a speed mapper. So this is a little bit different to a normal mapper. So a normal mapper generally prioritizes, a lot of damage to do red maps. You need a lot of damage to do stuff like Delirium and stuff like that. But a speed mapper generally purely prioritizes maximum AoE and movement speed. And these are generally put in place to speed farm stuff like Harbingers in Valor's Rest. In the past, they've been used to speed farm Legions in Legion League. Generally, they go for lower tier maps, and they try and abuse a certain mechanic in the game by going through it as fast as possible. In Harvest, people did, Harvest Seed Farmers, and generally there is a few other strategies that kind of play into this, but they basically prioritize maximum movement speed. So they use stuff like Queen of the Forest, and all sorts of stuff like that. So we just jump in game here. Queen of the Forest, all sorts of stuff like that. So that's a kind of a speed mapper. What else we got? We got a Lab Runner. So Lab Runner, similar to a speed mapper, prioritizes speed. They also prioritize, a little bit of defense so they don't get one-shot by lab traps. Incredible burst to one-shot Izaro. And their goal is to really get through the game, get through the labyrinth as fast as possible, and, make sure they can get as many enchants per hour as possible. So if you compare that to, for example, like a bosser or a normal mapper, they're not going to be anywhere near as efficient. A lab runner can run 4 or 5 times as many labs as a normal mapper can in the same time. So prioritizing specialization really is incredibly powerful. What else we got? We got a Delver. So Delvers generally kind of look to prioritize getting as deep in the Delve mine as possible. And these guys prioritize pure damage. They don't care about defense. They don't really care about anything but damage. They go for stuff like dodge as their defensive mechanic, and they pretty much go with no life, and they do maximum damage, and they basically, if they get hit, they're dead, but their whole goal is to one-shot everything before they do get hit. These guys go to like well over 6,000 depth, and they kind of really do make a lot of money in the Delve mine, but you could not do that on a traditional build. Those builds are so highly specialized, it allows them to go deep. Some examples of this is like the Delve Icicle Mine build, the Penance brand, all sorts of stuff like this is very, very powerful indeed. Just a few more we got here. We got a Delirium Farmer. Generally, these guys have fairly specialized builds as well. They use stuff like Self-Curse. They use stuff like Self-Poison to make like kind of like cheese damage. And they generally are going to be pretty much AoE focused and massive damage focused as well. Pretty much it's like a mapper, but with cheese on top, you know. So they go with the Self-Curse and all stuff like that. And then pretty much like some of the other ones here we have are like group play. You know, if you're playing an aura bot, that's a purely specialized build. Incredibly powerful in certain situations, but very, very limited in what it can do outside of them. You know, we've got stuff like, you know, some of the group carries who basically don't even function on their own. They can only exist in the context of a group because the group is giving them so many buffs they can do stuff like that. So basically at the end of the day here, you need to know what character that you're trying to build. You know, if you're trying to build a league start, look for the things I mentioned for a league starter. If you're trying to build a mapper, look for the things I mentioned for a mapper. This is really going to dictate what your build should look like. And if you're trying to create that build on your own, make sure you tick all those boxes that we highlighted. You know, if you're going for a mapper, it needs to have AoE. If it doesn't have AoE, it's not going to feel good. You know, if it doesn't have that proactive defense, you're probably just going to get randomly one shot. Stuff like that is incredibly important, and that's really what makes a good character. Specializing in one part of the game is going to make your character infinitely more powerful than a character that tries to go after everything. So with all that said, guys, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. Please prepare yourself because I'm going to be pumping out a ton of new player guides and also build guides, as well as a new series coming out, which I'm super excited about, and hopefully you guys are too. It's going to be focused on the entire journey of PoE. We're going to do rags to riches. So basically, I'm going to start on Twilight Strand with no gear and nothing, and I'm going to go all the way to max gear on a character. I'm incredibly excited about that one. Hopefully you guys are too. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.